Hi, it's Dr. Mike McGlynn here. We're well into winter now. It's freezing cold, ice slipping over when you're going outside. So I'm up in the winter office now. It's really cold in the other room, so I'm up here now. I've got machines that run down here, and I just remote into them. But yeah, it's cold, but it's beautiful. It's been really a beautiful day today. It's been a little bit of a while since I've made a video because I was out collecting. I've got a stove and out collecting wood and sawing up wood, and took a couple of whole days. So when I was going to do another video, I couldn't do it. But I was listening to material really for this video because this, I think, I mentioned this on me last two. I did a video which I split into two, but there's a single version as well, which is all about sort of like political involvement, the importance of political involvement, and the willingness and the openness to be involved politically, and why that should be good. And I was also approaching it very much from a Christian perspective of how important it is for Christians to be involved. But I think there's some stuff there, that's very relevant for people of any faith or none. So that hasn't had it hasn't has had many watches, which I've been a bit sort of disappointed about, because I really felt that that it's a good video, that they're a good seeker. I cover a lot of ground, and I just hope maybe it's because people are a bit sort of saturated with with the American election, or whatever. But I would encourage you, because I did a couple of blog posts that were associated with that for the material, and I really think it helps get a real feel of the subject. Now, this what I want to talk about today is I think I want to talk about what you might call the Locus Classicus, which is Latin for what the central issue or the main issue, or what you revolves around your sort of like your understanding. And this one is very specifically dealing with what I would consider, and I think what most people consider, the principal passage in the New Testament, and in fact, in the entire Christian scriptures and the Hebrew scriptures, that deals specifically with the relationship of someone to the state, the relationship of the individual to the state, the relationship of the church to the state, and very much, how should we view government? How should we view people that are in authority above us? How there's the real fundamental sort of like, you could say, sort of like ethics and political ethics, ethical issues, and it's amazing. There's only like 7 verses in Romans that deal with this, uh, and yet there's this enormous amount that flows out, enormous amount of scholarship that has flown out from just this passage, how to interpret this passage, how to put it in its proper context. Because on the surface, when we'll see that when we read it, but on the surface reading of it, you would think that the only position that's been advocated is is that whatever the government says we should do, and we should never rebel against the government. We should never have any. The Christian's duty is just to be obedient to the state, and and that and that particular interpretation was thrown at the church leaders in South Africa that were fighting against apartheid in that was what the some of the Dutch Reformed ministers would or people who had grown up in the Dutch Reformed, I would hesitate to call them proper ministers, but the government ministers would often quote Romans 13 to the bishops to say that you're inciting sedition and you're rebelling against the government, and your obligation is to accept that this government's been obligated by God, and whether it's been slavery or whether it's been every sort of excess in the UK. We've got the history of and the European, in a sense this is the history of Europe, and the monarchs and the relationship to the Pope, and whether or not the monarch has a divine right. There was something called James the Sixth of Scotland, who was obviously important for my heritage as a MacNeil, but he became James the First of England, and he was also, I think, the person responsible for the King James Bible, who sponsored the King James Bible. But he advocated something called the divine right of kings. So kings had the divine right to rule. It was as if, and so whatever the king said, the subjects were obligated uh, to obey without without the opportunity to disagree, because if you disagreed you were basically killed. So so part of this, really, this what I want to really discuss today is to in this discussion I'm very much following, very relying very much, this actually makes up, I think it's chapter 7 or chapter 8. It's the penultimate chapter of my book where I discuss this. And in a sense that in the book, because this was like just a chapter in the sense of that thesis, I pick up on, because I was very much into it, that how you relate to in a sense how you political. My view is that philosophy is practical, and that it should have relevance to everyday life, and so that's why I put that in the thesis. And the interesting thing was that when my examiners were examining the thesis, they actually asked me to remove it. They asked me to remove some other stuff. I had to do a lot of changes, to be honest, because what happened with me was that my initial supervisor, uh, there was a big reorganization at the university, and unfortunately he was left. This was sort of like during COVID, and so there was somebody else who was supervising me sort of like for the last year, and really it wasn't really their area. And although I was really grateful to Farhan for what, there were some little bits that he really helped me sort of with, and really sort of pushed me in some directions. But the 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 supervision was quite light. So when I actually got to the to the exam, the oral exam that you have to do, at that was actually like probably one of the best. Even though I thought it was going to be all day, I thought you were going to get examined all day. It turned out it was only like an hour, and I thought, well, an hour, PhD thesis being examining you in an hour. But it was quite it was quite a demanding hour actually. But what was very interesting was that I passed. I didn't fail. But there's sort of like, I think it's something like, there was like 3 levels of passing, where you can pass unconditionally. That basically means that they accept your thesis as uh, as it is. Then you get like the second level, that was called minor, sort of minor changes, where basically it means that the internal examiner, because you had to have like an internal examiner and an external examiner, and the chair. So it was like a 3-person committee who does the exam. And obviously the internal examiner is obviously somebody from within the university, but the external examiner is the real, they has the real weight in that sort of examination, in that exam. He's the, if you like, the subject expert. I requested an external examiner, and amazed, and it was actually Professor Murchadha, who's in Galway in the University of Ireland, but he's actually president, I think, of the Irish Philosophers Association. He's got an amazing sort of portfolio of his accomplishments of what he's done. Really interesting guy. If you, it was because I was originally approached him, I think, years ago, when I was looking into doing the doctorate as a possible supervisor. But then I remarried sort of around about near the beginning, and all my plans changed, and in the end I already had like an unconditional offer from from Bangor, where I'd done my bachelor's and my master's, and so in the end in some ways I took what I thought was the easy route. In some you often think of something, oh, the easy route, that might be better, but in some ways, it's easy to think in hindsight. It would have been a very interesting journey if I'd gone with with the professor for the entire uh, doctorate, when you actually sort of do. But it would have been, I think it would have been very, very different. And I it's you know, you often think, you know, that's why, in a sense, when you do a doctorate, it's just the beginning. You know, you're going to go off, you're going to do more research, you're going to do other things, and you never arrive. I think that's one of the things you have to be when you start to study, is that you never arrive. You have to know that you're on this journey. Gosh, I'm talking already. So this, you know, the reason why I was saying that was because philosophy as some people do just consider philosophy in a sense as therapeutic. You're just trying to understand a problem and clarify it, and of course that's a really important aspect of philosophy, is that you are clarifying the problem and you're seeing the problem. But some you know, especially modern analytical philosophy, that is all there is. And in many ways, sometimes in modern analytical philosophy, the tendency is to get so into the minutiae of things that you never actually synthesize out and actually make use. And so after I'd done the exam, they actually asked me to remove this chapter, which deals with, in a sense, what I think is the most important thing is when philosophy actually becomes practical. And you know, how does, in a sense, your philosophy, how you know, what practical implications has this got? So in many ways, I find this aspect of it, the political aspect, and how it interacts with what you believe and your theory of knowledge and how it all fits together. To me, this is one of the most interesting interface political philosophy in many ways. I think it's probably because, you know, by its nature, unless you're just trying to describe, you know, that's again the tendency of, say, the analytic, or especially the positivistic view of philosophy, is all you're actually doing is describing something that's actually happening. In a sense, you're just annotating it. And that's, whereas if you've got sort of like a more view where you're trying to solve philosophical problems, and that, I mean, that was one of the interesting things. You know, even though I probably disagree with most of Bertrand Russell's sort of like formulations and his general approach to philosophy, perhaps, but there was one good thing that he did actually. I think that he did have the, especially in his early days, maybe in his later days, maybe not, but especially in his early times, he actually really did believe that philosophy could solve problems. If you read his sort of like his history of philosophy, he actually talks a bit about, you know, the need to solve philosophical problems rather than just state them. The positivists were very much just about stating, which is quite interesting because he was one of the prime movers in that movement, especially in its early days in the Vienna Circle. But you know, the positivists just sort of said that we were in pursuit of knowledge, but it was knowledge in the sense of by description. They were just looking at, and science was very much just like you're enumerating something that's actually in nature, the phenomena of nature. You're never really sort of dealing or with solving the problems. You know that Carnap was even further. He said these are just pseudo problems. If you know, so reality is a pseudo problem. So one of the most important, you know, metaphysical issues in the entire universe, you know, existence, and what does existence mean, is a pseudo problem. You know, and that's something Russell said as well. He said Positive said it's a very interesting essay, actually. I'll see if I can dig it out, because I know I referenced it in the doctrine. It's in the references, but it was a very unusual collection of his essays, which was done, I think, at the end of the 1940s. I've just had sort of like a message flash. I thought I'd turned all these messages off. I thought I deliberately muted all the system messages there, and it just come in there. But anyway, in fact, I know I've muted them, but some apps still want to interrupt what you're doing. But it was very interesting. There was this collection of essays. I think was done at the end of the 40s. Very unusual collection, and it's interesting because it was like because there was an enormous collection of Russell's sort of like works that was done more like a formal sort of bibliography of his works, and an enormous thing which I've got on my shelf somewhere. But this was sort of something where, when he was still very much an active philosopher, but very much coming to the end of that sort of like active period on the bit. I think it was published just about the time where he'd gone to New York. He'd left Oxford or Cambridge, wherever he was, and in the UK, and he'd gone over to the US, and then he had all the trouble in the US. But in a sense, his move to the US, sort of like because he was so controversial over there, I would say a lot of his best philosophy were done. His influence waned very dramatically, I think, after the end of the 50s, and this collection was written then. But that's one of the things he writes in his retrospect on the logical positivism. I think he called it logical analysis or logical positivism. I know in history of Western philosophy, he tended to use the term logical analysis, but it was the logical positivist movement picked up that aspect in the sense of his thought, Wittgenstein's thought, and it became more likely to be referred to as logical positivism. I do believe there is sort of nuance, there is a difference there, but he was writing in the sense at the end of the period, end of his active period, looking back on logical positivism. And one of the things that he said about it was, he said that that logical positivism tends to be very narrow because it tends to reject the psychological aspect of knowledge, and it tends to trivialize problems, or it just calls something a pseudo problem when really it just moves the problem to the side rather than dealing with the problem. It dismisses things rather than looking at them, because it's just looking at things very narrowly in the sense of the logical relations, and then dismisses that psychological aspect or the metaphysical aspect of it, because that was one of the famous things, that they were famous for, was dismissing metaphysics or metaphysical questions as pseudo questions or as meaningless. That was the famous thing, wasn't it? Meaningless. You can't have a discussion about God because that's meaningless. And so, but he said it was very interesting because he was writing sort of like at that point, then make during that period, at the end of that period, and very much making that sort of like that point that that tendency to dismiss those problems and to those issues is really counterproductive, and the importance in the sense of philosophy is it's practical. So that's why I've put this, and that's why I certainly consider that this a really important issue, and that where it gets practical, and the interesting thing about Romans 13 is that because it's dealing so directly with an issue that's of central importance, really, because we obviously lived through the just lived through sort of like the pandemic period, and for most people, if they haven't lived through a war or a world war, that was a situation in which the state exerted itself very, very strongly and used its coercive powers to the full to really force people to stay inside, only permit them to go outside for an hour a day. In our nation, we're only allowed outside for an hour a day. People were being stopped by the police if they were outside, and it was it was basically tyrannical. You weren't allowed to travel, you weren't allowed to the only exceptions were, if you were so-called key worker, if you're working in a hospital, or of course, in the sense, politicians exempted themselves from most of the legislation and had their parties and everything else, and for so it was a real there was a real assault on people's liberty, and a lot of those things that had been in our law built up of 100 years were suddenly just pushed aside. And so it's a real issue, because one of the big I wrote a lot about it at the time, and I will try and put some of the references in, and I was amazed at the response of people who are supposed to be Christian leaders, and their complete, almost like the total capitulation to it. There's only one person I know in the area I live in who offered any sort of resistance, and the place where and really, you can count on one hand, people that decide, leaders Christian leaders who, worldwide, who made a stand. And so it was really interesting for me because I was writing at that time. I was off doing research for my doctorate, and I'd read somebody called Martyn Lloyd Jones, Dr. Martyn Lloyd Jones, who he I think he when did he die? I think he died in the maybe 77, 78. But he was at I think he was the one of the leaders at what was called Westminster Chapel in London, and it was basically like a Presbyterian chapel. But he's generally recognised as one of the most systematic and rigorous of the evangelical, what's called expositional preaching, is where you're really trying to, analyze. It's like I suppose it's like the analytical method applied to the scriptures. He was a very much an exegete, somebody that showed you what was there, clarified the terms, and then exposited it, which basically means how does this then apply to life. So you clarify actually what's there, and then you're going to apply it to life. And he's done this very famous series, and the amount of material that he generated, I think he was he trained as a physician. I think in the mid-30s he left, so he must have been around, and I think he was familiar with the First World War as well. So he had this enormous breadth of sort of like of knowledge, and he became, I'm not sure when he became the minister at the chapel, but there's this very famous period, I think, from the 40s, 50s, 60s, where he was I think he was the prime minister then. I think he retired sort of like maybe the early 70s or the very late 60s, and then he then continued to minister and to travel and publish. But he's very famous for this his commentary on Romans. I mean, I've got it's like this, it's like 15 sort of books, but they're actually like transcriptions of his sermons, rather than something formally written. Although there's a couple of volumes in there that are so unbelievably detailed, and I think if these are transcriptions, this is astonishing. But I know some of them are transcriptions, and they've only recently, I think, been completed. His works had a whole new people. I think there's some committee that's taken over the estate. There's a whole website which I'll put the links and everything up there. And most of the material, I think virtually all his material, but he's got like hundreds of messages on John, on Romans, on Ephesians, and I think it's now all free for download. They make it all available free for download. And but he in his discussion of Romans, I'm not sure how. I think I must have been interested in how the passage was interpreted, because I'd heard some of these very brutal interpretations of the passage even before COVID. Of people talking about Romans 13 and that we're to obey the government. That's who we are. And I can remember the first time I read that passage, because I'd sort of, in my youth particularly, I was very much involved in extreme left-wing politics, and I was even I called myself sort of like an anarchist. But and so it was very interesting to read that passage. After my conversion, I still can remember the first time I read that passage, and it had an impact on me, because I was thinking, gosh, this is telling me I have to obey my government, and everything in me didn't want to obey my government. So it's but his account of that, and his analysis of it, and the of how you need to interpret this passage, because on the surface reading of it, it does seem very, and we'll read, when I read it, you'll see that it really gives the impression that unconditional obedience. But he goes through and actually makes the point, and he talks about that, that a Christian can be or people are perfectly at liberty to join revolutionary movements or to eject their government, or so I mean, in a sense, I want to get to that point. I want to step, progress through to that point. But that, in a sense, is the is to understand this passage properly, and to really understand the history of how of the relationship between what the proper relationship between the church and state should be, because in various points of church history, it's been conceived of and thought of very differently, and the way the reformers, in many ways, had had this sort of dramatic insight and dramatic change, and broke from the Roman Catholic view. But somehow the Roman Catholic view of the relationship between church and state sort of was reintroduced back into an early Protestantism, and it became hegemonical as well in its, and quite tyrannical. And then you have the history of of the Puritan movements, and then the Great Migration, sort of like to the US, and yet somehow it became very tyrannical as well. The early settlements in sort of like in Massachusetts, the colonies, and how how destructive to individual liberty and freedom, and those people that had gone to the US for the gone to the New World for the purpose of religious freedom, suddenly found that they reproduced that sort of tyranny. And it really wasn't until the works, some very famous Puritan called Roger Williams, who really, and his work, and he founded the Rhode Island colony, Rhode Island sort of like colony and state, eventually Providence. I think it's Providence was and he really, and his views, he was, without realizing, a lot of people don't realize that he probably set the character of the US with its regard to religious pluralism, the relationship between church and state, and that church and state are separated. And his view of democracy, he probably, the American model of democracy, the American culture, probably owes more to Roger Williams than people actually realize. He's probably one of the most pivotal and important characters in the history of the US, in the sense of how the Constitution was eventually formed and framed, and the relationship between church and state. It owes more to him than anyone else. So in a sense, that's like a little bit of the preview of where I want to go. But okay, so I'll just pause here, because that's just like a little bit of the preamble, I think, and then the next one is where we really dig in to Romans 13. Okay, see you very shortly. Bye.